Yeah. So when you want to summarize Egypt, there's a lot of things you can mention. Okay. The fact that I'll connect my computer so you can see everything I see. The fact that they were a very dense culture. They had a lot of things that made up what Egyptian civilization really cared about. All right. When it comes to, first off, the idea of the pharaohs being gods, right? That's a big idea, right? That shows you the religion is very dense with a lot of different ideas, a lot of different gods themselves, a lot of traditions, especially when it comes to like mummification, used the building of pyramids. And then the fact that they were dependent on the Nile itself shows you how much they really, because even the Nile was seen as a god because of how much they cared about it. And you saw in the worksheet you did that they created like hymns for the Nile, like they showed how dependent they were on the Nile. So it's really important to them. And then how good they were at science, writing. They even created calendars, right? They had all these different things you could use to kind of mention some fun facts about Egypt. Because when we have another assessment, right? Let's just say next week, okay? Let's go probably a week from today. We'll have our assessment on the River Valley civilizations a week from today, right? And if I give you like a written question about Egypt, that's a good way to talk about some of the major points of Egypt, what you guys just did. You take major topics, and then you write about the summary of it, okay? I'm not saying that's what the written question is, but that's an easy way for you to get a handle of what Egypt's civilization is about, all right? Okay, so let's now look at the Indus River Valley, all right? So as I mentioned to you guys the other day, if you guys were to take notes, this would be smart for you because what can you use it as? It's your study guide. Right? Your bonus points. Yeah. That's fine too. That's okay. But like, let's just say you were to use like a Word or OneNote, and you were to take notes, like added stuff, and you can add that stuff to it. Or if you want to just hand in that, it's all up to you. If you think it's better for you to study using a Quizlet, then do that. I'm not going to tell you the best way to study. I'll give you obviously the information that you should look at, but there's a wide ranging of different applications you can use to help you study. So Quizlet's a great one. I mentioned that in the beginning of the first day of class. So you go right ahead. If you want to use OneNote, you want to use Word, go right. There's a whole bunch of them. So yeah, that's fine. You can do Quizlet. Just make sure that you have the information you need. Okay. All right. So when you talk about the Indus River Valley, now the Indus River Valley is not going to be as long as Egypt. Like when we talked about Egypt, we spent literally the entire class talking about the information of Egypt to the point where we didn't have as much time to work on the actual worksheet like we normally do. Because there's so much stuff in Egypt that you can talk about. Not saying the Indus River Valley doesn't have a lot, but usually you can kind of look at the Indus River Valley and focus on really two major concepts with them, okay? And the two concepts with them that they're really most famous for is the availability of trade, right, because of their location, and how amazing they were at city planning. Their planned cities were revolutionary for the time. To the point they even had their own plumbing system, okay? And for plumbing system to happen in ancient times is unheard of, okay? So that's why when you look at Indus River Valley, those are the two major key things you need to look at, okay? Now, when you look at the location of the Indus River Valley civilization, we always point to it's in India, okay? Now, but it also encompasses some other areas as well. The subcontinent or landmass that it is part of is India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, okay? Now, the environment around the Indus River Valley civilization is really important. We mentioned how Mesopotamia literally had zero help in defending against nomadic tribes, right? Remember the Tigris and Euphrates weren't really good barriers for them. They didn't have a lot of mountain ranges to stop any invasion. The Egyptian civilization had at least the desert to stop anyone from coming from the west, right? But they were still available to be attacked from the south and also the northeast. Now, when it comes to the Indus River Valley, they were actually set up perfectly, right? Because not only did they have the Indus River, but they had a lot of these mountain ranges on the very top above them. And they were part of a peninsula, okay, where basically they were surrounded by water. So there's no way they can be ever attacked from the south, right? And with the mountains on top, it was very difficult for anyone to attack from the north. So they were pretty lucky, right? Because they're spot on in a perfect location, right? Now the Indus River here is very similar to the Nile and very similar to I think it's probably better than the Tigris and Euphrates because it was key to their civilization, right? And the reason why I say that I think it's better than Tigris and Euphrates is because it wasn't as inconsistent as that river. It's probably closer to the Nile River when it comes to consistency of flooding, okay? All right. However, the big thing they always had to deal with were monsoons, okay? Now, when you take a look at monsoons, these are seasonal winds, right? Now, the winter winds or winter monsoons are very dry. Summer winds will bring a lot of rain with it. So there's two different types of monsoons that occur with the Indus River Valley, right? And they have the two different pictures here. The monsoon winters, a lot of the dry air would be blowing, out to the sea, and then the summer winds would be blowing from the sea into the Indus River Valley, causing a lot of storms to happen. Okay, and this would cause some issue. This is like the biggest thing, the biggest environmental issue that they had when located in this area. Not saying that there was no storms in Egypt or Mesopotamia, but when you're located around water, like if you're a peninsula, you get hit by a lot more, seasonal storms than you would anywhere else. Look at Florida, right? Florida is very similar to that concept where they have the hurricane season, right? Where they get hit with storms constantly all the time, right? Because of their location by the water, okay? Same thing happens here. Now, the thing is, with a lot of these different types of storms, it didn't help the rivers when it came to flooding, right? As I mentioned, normally, if the storms weren't a problem, the flooding wouldn't be a big deal. However, with the increasing in storms happening more often, the flooding became unpredictable, right? When it wasn't storm season, the rivers are okay. But when it was storm season, it was a big problem, right? So think of it this way. If it's too little rain, it's a big deal because the crops don't get watered. Too much rain, it destroys everything. So the inconsistency of these storms could be an issue. So that is the one thing you would say about the Indus River Valley. They would have issues with the storms more often than the river itself, but a mix of the two is not really a great thing, okay? Now, when you take a look at the Indus River Valley civilization itself, okay, they were less known about than Egypt and Mesopotamia. They had less of a writing system that allowed us to know about their history, okay? But one thing that allowed us to know about them was their city planning. They actually had provided very in-depth maps and networking of their buildings to the point where they didn't actually say like, oh, parentheses, college. But what they did was they did layer out and make basically a block system of all their major buildings. So we were able to look at that and understand, what buildings they really cared about, which buildings, based on location and size, that we can say they were deemed as their center of their civilization, okay? Now, probably one of the most important things, as I mentioned already, was their ability to build was incredible. And you guys saw the mud brick buildings, right? Where it was a mixture of mud, mixture of manure, mixture of straw and water, right? Created these very thick mud bricks that when dried, they were not the same, but similar to bricks that you see today. And allowed them to create massive amount of buildings pretty quickly, okay? Now, I can't imagine the smell of those buildings, right? Imagine just living in a manure brick house. That'd be pretty miserable, right? But it allowed them to build these really large cities, okay? Very organized cities. But I think the most important, really the cool thing of the time was that they created a sewage system, right? Which is, for an ancient time period, is pretty insane. So let's take a look at a quick little video here Mohenjo-Daro, just to give you kind of a sense of how in-depth this really was.
The ancient city of Mohenjo-Daro is one of the first urban centers in human history. Nestled in southern Pakistan's Indus River Valley, Mohenjo-Daro is the largest and best preserved city of the Indus civilization, the earliest known civilization of the Indian subcontinent. Mohenjo-Daro was built around 2500 BC, about the same time the Great Pyramids were being built in Egypt, and it spanned a surface area of nearly 500 acres, an incredible size for a city of this time period. Because of Mohenjo-Daro's grand scale, archaeologists believe it may have served as a seat of power for the Indus civilization. The city was divided into two districts, the Citadel and the Lower Town. The Citadel is home to the city's exceptional monuments, including the Great Bath, a 900-square-foot tank fed from the Indus River. Mohenjo-Daro also had a sophisticated water system. Houses had baths and toilets, and the town featured both an elaborate sewage system and fresh water in 700 wells throughout the city. The Roman baths, some of history's most famous waterway systems, weren't constructed until many hundreds of years after Mohenjo-Daro's Great Bath. Mohenjo-Daro has no places of worship or governance, such as palaces, royal tombs, or temples. This may indicate that the society was not built around state interests like the Egyptian and Mesopotamian societies at the time. Rather, the class structure of Mohenjo-Daro may have been relatively equal. The city's second district, the Lower Town, may demonstrate the society's egalitarian structure. The Lower Town, with its intricate water system, was home to between 20,000 to 40,000 people. Unlike many urban areas of its time, it was laid out in a grid system similar to modern-day city blocks. After approximately 600 years, the city collapsed. No one is quite sure why, but the cause could potentially have been a change within the culture, or in the path of the river. Without its crucial source of water, the city's residents may have moved away, leaving Mohenjo-Daro nearly abandoned. In 1911, nearly 4,000 years after the city fell into ruin, archaeologists paid their first visit. The ensuing decades of excavations have unearthed countless clues that tell the tale of Mohenjo-Daro, but it still holds secrets for us to discover.
Okay, so for an ancient civilization, they were very, very advanced for especially the city building itself. And as you could tell, the massive size of just one city shows you how in-depth they were, or how advanced they were for their time, okay? And that's kind of like what I mentioned here. The city planning was extremely crucial, or even just fascinating, right, for this time, because not even in Egypt or even Mesopotamia did they have this type of planning out of these massive cities. And they did have mud bricks too. It wasn't like they didn't have the capability of doing it. They just didn't really follow the same course, okay? And what's interesting about the Indus River Valley is that they didn't really focus on religion as much as we've seen in the past two civilizations we've talked about, okay? Now, I have another video here, and I'm just like, I know we're just like watching, it's like a movie, right? But this goes into the city planning itself.
Features of the Harappan civilization. Part 1.
Actually, you know what? We don't have to do this one. I've seen this one 100 times. We don't have to do this one. It's basically, it already covers everything we talked about. So, as already mentioned in the video, and what I've talked about before, what the city itself was made sure to kind of encompass all classes at the time. Now, what's interesting is, as time progresses, and we start to talk about different civilizations of not only in India, but in Asia in general, a class system does get developed, right? And it's probably one of the more famous one, the caste system, right, gets developed in that same area. So it's kind of funny to see how it starts, where there's not really different classes, and now it gets transitioned into having a class system. So it's hard to understand a lot of the information of the Indus River Valley because they mentioned they didn't really leave a lot behind in certain aspects, right? Especially when it came to religion. But when it came to the language itself, you can tell it was similar to hieroglyphics, but it was more complicated than that because they didn't have a system in which it was translatable, right? It was very unknown. But we can tell that they used symbols that would represent phrases or certain words. Hieroglyphics were a lot easier, I think, over time to translate, especially with the Rosetta Stone. Okay, so even to this day, we couldn't really understand completely of the Indus River Valley, especially with their language. Right? Now, they didn't really have as much of a culture. They didn't really have social divisions, as we mentioned, and they didn't really leave a lot behind. But some things we did notice was that they left some structures that had animal printings on them, or even some clay printings of animals. So it shows you that they had some sort of care about animals. Yeah. This was all in the Indus River Valley. Yeah. It was all just in this river valley. So they didn't leave too much behind for us to go on. The biggest thing you have to understand when it comes to Indus River Valley is what is left behind are the city structures. And that's why I keep telling you it's about the city planning, right? Whenever you hear about the Indus River Valley, think of the city planning itself, right? Now, religious artifacts, there were some left behind, but they really weren't to the same level as Egyptian civilization, right? That's why we know so much about Egyptian gods, is because they left basically paintings upon paintings, or even hieroglyphics of these different gods that they left behind. Rather, in really Indus River Valley, they didn't leave too much behind for us to go on. Now, it does give you a sense of the origins of even the Hindu god, right, Shiva, right? That does start here. However, we'll learn more about that later on when the religions start to kind of grow in these areas, okay? But the other major point that I mentioned, the city planning was important, but it was the trade that was probably the most important, okay? And the reason why trade is the most important of the area is because of their location, right? They're located along the peninsula, and they have several different rivers around them. And their spot in Asia allows them to have interactions with different groups. As you guys will learn later on, I think in this course we'll talk about it, the Silk Road becomes a major trading route that is developed. And it obviously starts in China, but it goes through India, right? Because of the location of India, allows them to have access to a lot of different types of cultures, and they end up really prospering because of that connection with the world, okay? Now, just like we've seen in other civilizations, there was a decline in this one as well. What usually we always associate with how the Indus River Valley collapsed, or how really the decline occurred, was solely because of the natural disasters that happened. Usually we can't really talk about how, in the last two civilizations, there was nomadic tribes that came and destroyed them. I think what we always see is, with those civilizations, they didn't have a lot of natural barriers, right? Egypt had the desert, but other than that, they didn't. Indus River Valley had barriers, so it seems that they would have lasted a lot longer. The problem was that they were dealing with a lot more natural issues or natural environmental challenges compared to the other two civilizations we mentioned, right? A lot of historians usually kind of look at earthquakes or even the floods, the monsoons, causing really instability, right? Remember how we talked about how if it doesn't flood enough, then a lot of people will die because of starvation, right? If it floods too much, it'll destroy the crops. So this was kind of the unstable lifestyle of the Indus River Valley. Yeah. Tsunamis? Yeah. I'm guessing there would be, because they're located on the peninsula. Well, I'm sure it caused a lot of issues. I don't know if it wiped them out completely from a tsunami, just one tsunami, but I think over time, a lot of those different types of environmental issues led to them losing a lot of their crops, losing a lot of their power. Because think of it this way: if there is, let's say a tsunami happens, right, and they lose all their crops for that year, a lot of people are going to die. And they might not be able to bounce back as quickly as they would like. All right, and that could definitely lead to their fall. I think what we usually historians point to is a mixture of not only just natural disaster when it comes to flooding, but the fact that some rivers dried up and they didn't have the water now to kind of water their crops. And then people died out because of starvation, and they had to leave, right? As I mentioned in the video, Mohenjo-Daro was a prosperous city, but then the river changed course, as in because of natural causes, right, where the flooding happened and it changed into a different route. Then people just left the city because they didn't want to starve out over there, right? So that kind of happened with a lot of times in this area. Now, with not a stable governing force in around 1500, the Aryans enter the area and they take over. And we'll talk about them more in the next chapter, okay? I posted for you guys.